last objection to the Gospels is actually the biggest one that people have.
Did Jesus really raise himself from the dead? Let's take a look.
As I read those stories, I feel terribly sympathetic for the followers of Jesus, because I hear hope there, not history.
We have to explain two historical facts. We have to explain the empty tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and we have to explain the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection to his disciples. Any theory of history that wants to explain how the disciples came to believe these things has to explain those two facts. The idea that the disciples would not die for a lie is a very common argument that our side uses, and it has a great deal of strength, particularly when we look at the social background of the New Testament. What the disciples were claiming in context was astonishing and incredible, because Jesus, as one crucified, had been subjected to an incredibly shameful death, and as such he had been judged by the powers that be to be completely unworthy of recognition. And by the accounting of the disciples, the people who lived at that time, God, having allowed this, would have said the same thing. This man is not deserving of any honor whatsoever. They would have lost everything and gained nothing by claiming something like this. There were much easier things they could have done, simply recognized him as a great teacher and started their own movement. That would have been extremely low risk. To go this far and to claim that he had risen from the dead was extremely high risk and had no payoff whatsoever. When we say that someone is going to lie about something, they're going to do it for some benefit. And the question that has to be answered is, what benefit did the disciples get out of claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead? In claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, they were saying he deserved honor that the rulers of that age said he did not. And they opened themselves up, therefore, to every kind of social persecution.
In his book, The Historical Jesus, John Dominic Crossan is clear about the agenda behind his attack on the truth of the resurrection. Remember that in Crossan's mind, the resurrection is not plausible, and the gospel accounts are not reliable. Therefore, he uses historical reconstructions based upon what he believes might have happened. Again, there are no written historical records to back up his claims. Instead, he writes, "If you cannot believe in something produced by reconstruction, you may have nothing left to believe in." Crossan's attack on the truth of the resurrection in the big picture is really an attack on the nature of truth itself. According to Crossan, truth fluctuates from generation to generation. He writes, "It is not that we find once and for all who the historical Jesus was way back then. It is that each generation and century must redo that historical work and establish its best reconstruction. It is that Jesus reconstructed in the dialogues, debates, controversies, and all the conclusions of contemporary scholarship that challenges faith to see and say how that is, for now, the Christ, the Lord, the Son of God." In Crossan's reconstructed version of the story, Jesus' death was accidental, the type of execution that the oppressive and arbitrary justice of the Romans might carry out on any given day. In the days following the crucifixion, one or more of the apostles may have invented a story about Jesus' resurrection from the dead in order to give themselves some credibility. And then some followers of the apostles, who just happened to be scribes, may have recorded the event as though it were history. Another unfortunate accident, according to Crossan. But Crossan fails to answer some obvious questions. If the resurrection was a hoax, why would there be a Christian movement in the years after Jesus' death? If Christ's death were an accident, why would there even be a scribe who would want to record a distorted record of Jesus' death? Lacking answers to these questions, as well as any real evidence for their claims, the scholars of the Jesus Seminar speculate endlessly as to how and why the resurrection story came about.
Some scholars think the resurrection stories were borrowed from Eastern pagan cults popular throughout the Roman world at the time, called mystery religions.
And one of the things I believe that early Christians did is they took the model of the mystery religions. They took that story and retold that story as the story of Jesus.
Well, there are huge lists of these supposed divine God men that are said to have also been crucified, also been buried, also risen from the dead after 3 days. But I find each time I look into these that one of two things has happened. Either the information is completely wrong, in other words, they never actually were crucified, or what has happened is that the story of them being crucified happened hundreds of years after the time of Jesus and probably was influenced by Christian missionaries. One of the more prominent examples of someone who's written on this thesis are co-authors Timothy Freke and Peter Gandhi. They're a couple of British writers who wrote a book entitled The Jesus Mysteries. Quite effectively, for their symbolism, they put on the front cover of their book a picture of an amulet depicting Dionysus as crucified like Jesus. Appropriately enough, when you look into the origins of that amulet, you find in the very resource they used to get that picture that that amulet was declared a forgery, and that's not an authentic amulet depicting Dionysus. And so it's very appropriate, I think, that they have a forgery on the cover of their book. The only one of these pagan godmen that really has any hope as a viable candidate is the Egyptian deity Osiris, who reportedly was killed, cut into several pieces, and then was put together again and supposedly rose from the dead. The problem with comparing him is that, first of all, it is not a resurrection in the Jewish sense. A resurrection, as Jesus underwent, was a case of a dead body being glorified by God and receiving divine energies that brought it to life again. Whereas in the case of Osiris, what happened with him was a function of the way the Egyptian gods worked. Their bodies essentially never died, and so you could put their bodies back together after they were cut apart, sort of like a Frankenstein monster. And that's simply the way things work. In the other Egyptian mythologies, we have the gods taking off pieces of their bodies and lending them to other gods. The Norse god Balder allegedly being crucified would be one of the least viable examples, because the Norse legends would have to post-date Jesus and Christian missionary activity among those peoples by literally 1,000 years.
The writers of the New Testament also mention the mystery religions, most notably the apostles Peter, John, and Paul. What is being described here is Gnosticism, an Eastern cult that had followers the world over at the time of the Roman Empire. At the time of Jesus, even Judaism had succumbed to the effects of the ancient mystery religions. But do similarities among stories told among cults and mystery religions disprove the resurrection of Jesus? Let's look at some evidence. According to the Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 15:5-8, there were over 500 eyewitnesses, including the apostles, who saw Jesus after the resurrection. Many preached the gospel, and a few of them wrote books and testimonies. There is also the testimony of the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the blood of the martyrs of the first century. Many of the eyewitnesses to Christ's resurrection died as martyrs for their faith. It would be hard to imagine people dying for a fraudulent claim.
Well, this recent theory about a lost tomb of the family of Jesus reached into some significance for a collection of names that was found in a family tomb. Particularly Jesus, son of Joseph, was listed. Mary was listed in there. The name Mary was held by a quarter of Jewish women at the time. According to reports, this tomb had 35 skeletons in it. And just by that accounting, you're likely to find at least one or two Marys anyway. Supposedly, the ossuary said, Mary the Master, or Mary who is known as Master. And the connection was made immediately to this as Mary Magdalene by the theorists about this tomb. But in order to reach this conclusion, they had to go to a 4th century heretical document, the Acts of Philip, where they said Mary Magdalene was called a master. But that's not at all true. When you look at that document, she is not specified as Mary Magdalene, and in fact the leading scholar on this subject, one that they actually used, does not say that it's Mary Magdalene, but rather that the woman there is a conglomeration of Mary Magdalene and Mary, the sister of Martha. Mary Magdalene is not equated with the sinful woman in the Gospels. That equation did not occur until the time of Pope Gregory, and most scholars believe that it was mistaken, and the Catholic Church itself has said that Gregory was mistaken on that count.
In contrast, Marcus Borg of the Jesus Seminar states,
if we don't understand why he could be executed, then we miss the political passion that animated his mission. And when we turn the story of Jesus instead into the eternal sacrifice for sin that makes our forgiveness possible, then we really set aside that which mattered so much to him, namely the poor, the untouchables,